Hey everybody, this is Bridget. You'll hear from Kaleab a little bit later on. Hope everyone's doing okay. Our journal club presentation was on new records and aerobic power among octogenarian lifelong endurance athletes. So some keywords, we have octogenarian, which is an individual between 80 and 89. We have VO2 max, which is for aerobic capacity and maximum oxygen uptake. They're switched back and forth throughout the paper and the PowerPoint. We have METs, which is a metabolic equivalent, which is also just another way of measuring aerobic capacity that we see in the paper. We have two oxidative enzymes that we look at in the paper, citrate synthase and beta HAD. And then we have some messenger RNA, mRNA, which is used in mitochondrial biogenesis. And the two mitochondrial biogenesis targets that we look at are PGC1 alpha and TFEM. You'll also see T, which is trained, and UT, which is untrained, throughout the paper. And obviously, we have HR for heart rate and BP for blood pressure. So, some background information: we know that VO2 max, or aerobic capacity, is a range. We have an upper limit of about 90 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and that's common in elite athletes. So that's our marathon runners, our cross-country skiers who are competing in the Olympics, those types of athletes. And then we have a lower limit, which is approximately 17.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And if you're closer to that number, then there's an increased risk of mortality. So we want to be somewhere in between that range. We aren't going to be up there with elite athletes, but we don't want to be down there where there's an increased risk for mortality. And just so we're aware, there is a difference of about 73 milliliters per kilogram per minute between the two ends of the spectrum. A great way for us to stay in between the two limits is through endurance training. We can target our aerobic capacity with endurance training, and we can see an increase of about 15 to 30% in our personal aerobic capacity if we include endurance training. And we have a lot of knowledge about aerobic capacity for the ages between 20 and 75 for athletes and non-athletes, but there is a large knowledge gap from about 80 and above because it's challenging to find that population who's willing to participate in such tests like the one we're going to read about today. Some more background information. The best way to observe aerobic capacity and what they did in this article is to do a VO2 max test, because VO2 max is the most telling of what our aerobic capacity is. They also did a skeletal muscle biopsy and looked at oxidative profiles in the cells because, as we know, our aerobic capacity affects our oxidative metabolism. So in this paper, they do cellular and molecular muscle biopsy to see how it varies in non-trained and trained athletes. So the study objective was to observe healthy, independent living men over 80. It's important to study this population because we don't have much knowledge about it. And since they are independent, that's uncommon because most times around 80 and above, our elderly population is not living completely independently by themselves. So it's interesting that we have a population that is independent over 80. So the goal of the study was to understand octogenarian aerobic health because we don't have any knowledge on that. So we looked at the cardiovascular system and the skeletal muscle health. And the goal, overall arching goal, was to establish new upper limits for aerobic capacity in men 80 to 91 years of age. So for our methods, we had two groups of participants. 9 were lifelong endurance athletes. They came from Sweden, and they were members of the Masters Cross Country Skiing team there. And in order to be included in this group, they had a minimum of 50 years of consistent training, and it had to be endurance training, so we can see in their history that it was vigorous aerobic exercise training in cross country skiing and track, and that training was 4 to 6 days a week. And they also had to have no more than 6 months off at a time during the past 50 years of their training. The opposite group was our untrained octogenarians, and there were 6 non-exercise men. They came from Indiana, and they had no history of consistent exercise. Their exercise total entailed activities of daily living, so moving about the house, cooking meals, doing laundry, activities like that. When they were screened, they had to fill out exercise and medical questionnaires, and they had a personal interview. And then they had to do a physical exam that included a medical history, blood samples, resting EKG, and blood pressure. They were excluded from the group if they had acute or chronic illness, had cardiac, pulmonary, liver, or kidney abnormalities, if they had hypertension, diabetes, or abnormal blood chemistry, arthritis, a history of neuromuscular problems, or smoked tobacco. We can see in Table 1 that the age for the two groups was quite similar. So was their height. The weight was for the athletes was a little bit lower, but it wasn't considered significant. But BMI was considered significant. The athletes had a BMI that fell in the normal range for weight, while the untrained had a BMI that would technically be considered overweight. We also can see from their daily steps that it was significant and that the octogenarian athletes had almost double the amount of steps as the untrained, but that number also included their daily exercise as athletes, but that meant that during their daily exercise they were getting around 3,500 to 400 to 4,000 steps more compared to the untrained. So as part of the methods, medications were tracked because it's not uncommon for people 80 and above to be on medications for various health reasons. We see that the trained and untrained group both had members who were taking medicine for cholesterol, and they both had members who were taking medicine for blood pressure. The untrained group had a couple of members who were using thyroid medicine, and both groups had members who were using medicine for bladder and prostate issues, as well as acid reflux. Body composition was taken via a dual X-ray absorptiometry, and that just looked over the body composition of the members, and it was taken after they were in supine rest for 30 minutes. And then physical activity was monitored via a pedometer, and they had to wear it for 2 weeks upon waking up and taking it off prior to go to bed. And they had to wear it for at least 12 hours a day, and any periods of rest that lasted more than 60 minutes was not included in the 12 hours. The VO2 max test, or the aerobic capacity test, was done using a bike test, and it was tested continuously and incrementally. They had to use a bike test because for an untrained individual who's the age of 80 or above, to ask them to do a treadmill test would be a lot. And then the muscle biopsy was done using samples of the vastus lateralis, and they did analysis of the skeletal muscle enzymes and the skeletal muscle RNA. So the citrate synthase they looked at by using a reagent that adds a yellow color, and that's this DTNB. And through that, they were able to look at the reduction to grasp understanding of what the citrate synthase looked like. And then for the beta HAD, they used a method that is called fluorometrically, and they used this method to look at the disappearance of NADH and to determine the way the beta HAD reacted. And then for the skeletal muscle RNA, they used a specific reagent to each gene, and they used this method, which right here is just an arbitrary unit quantification method, and they were able to look at how the gene expression varied between each group. So for our results in the maximal aerobic power test, we found a bunch of significant differences between the octogenarian athletes and the non-athletes. They found that absolute VO2 max, which is this right here, was 58% higher in the athletes compared to the untrained. They found that relative VO2 max was significantly higher in the athletes compared to the untrained. They found that relative VO2 max in reference to body weight was 80% higher in athletes compared to the untrained. There was a 25% higher ventilation in the octogenarian athletes compared to the untrained. They found there wasn't a significant difference in heart rate, but if you look at the heart rate, it's interesting because for someone who's 80 years old, having a heart rate of 160 as their max heart rate is considered very high. And then if you come on here to O2 pulse, which is oxygen per heartbeat, the athletes had a significant difference, and theirs was 41% higher compared to the untrained. There wasn't very much of a difference in the RER because for most of us, you're going to be hitting max effort at an RER around 1.1 to like 1.2. So there shouldn't be much of a difference. And then you can see that in the final workload, there was a significant difference in that there was a 39% greater difference in the workload for the athletes than the non-athletes. On this result slide, we have individual VO2 max of our octogenarian athletes and untrained octogenarians graphed on the normative values for healthy men across the lifespan graph. And on the y-axis, you can see our VO2 max, which is in relative terms, and age on the x-axis in years. So if you see our black dots, those are the octogenarian athletes. And if you look across the graph, you see the 50th percentile dotted line in the middle. And all of our octogenarian athletes are above that 50th percentile, around the 75th percentile, maybe even a little bit higher, closer to the 95th percentile. And then in the opposite end of the graph, we have our white dots, which is untrained octogenarians. And we can see that they all fall below the 50th percentile, closer to that 5th percentile. And there's actually 2 of them that are really close to that dotted line for independence along the bottom. And if they fall below that line, then they're going to have an increased risk for mortality and dependence on other people. So we can see that the difference in the athletes and the octogenarian untrained is pretty significant in that their VO2 max for the athletes puts them much higher and further away from the independence line than for our untrained octogenarians.
Hello everyone, it's Kaleab. I'm looking at the differences in the skeletal muscle enzymes. There were significant differences between both groups. There was a 54% increase in citrate synthase and a 42% increase in beta HAD levels in octogenarian athletes, as seen on the graphs. Looking at the skeletal muscle RNA, there was also significant differences between the athletes and the untrained octogenarians. Basal levels of PGC1 alpha was 135% higher in the athletes, and then TFAM was 80% higher in the athletes as well. Looking at the correlations, there were many significant positive correlations. There was positive correlations between VO2 max and workload, VO2 max and maximum ventilation, VO2 max and O2 pulse, VO2 max and skeletal muscle oxidative enzymes. There was one non-significant negative correlation made, but it was between VO2 max and maximal heart rate. So both groups are actually pretty unique. The athletes were lifelong athletes, so they've been exercising for essentially 50 years continuously. The non-athletes, despite being untrained, they are highly independent in functional ability. One of the athletes was actually a 91-year-old former Olympic champion with an aerobic capacity of 36 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The athletes averaged about 3,700 more steps per day than the non-athletes. However, the non-athletes average about 4,300 steps per day, which is respectable for people who are 80 years old. The oxygen pulse, which is an indicator of stroke volume, declined octogenarian athletes was actually pretty modest, with continued endurance training from 25 milliliters per minute at 25 to approximately 16 milliliters per minute as octogenarians. Higher maximum ventilation in octogenarian athletes, 78%, was greater than the 75 liters per minute compared to the untrained, 16%. Higher oxidative profile of mitochondrial markers in skeletal muscle in octogenarian athletes compared to untrained normally declines with age, but not reversible with training. Using the data from previous studies to compare VO2 maxes with our current study, you can see there's a big difference between the octogenarian athletes of this study and the other athletes, or the other octogenarians from previous studies. I have them circled in yellow. Looking at the previous studies, they're mostly around their low 20s. None of them actually make it past 28. However, the average VO2 max for the octogenarians in this study was 38 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And actually, if you look at the previous studies with the octogenarians, most of them are relatively close to the 17.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute lower threshold, which is the prognostic for aerobic frailty. The study said that the high aerobic power achieved by the octogenarian athletes is comparable to healthy, non-endurance trained men 20 years younger than them in the 75th percentile, men who are non-endurance trained 40 years younger than them in their 50th percentile, and non-endurance trained men who are 60 years younger than them in the 20th percentile. So the athletes were around 11 METs, which is the highest aerobic capacity reported for octogenarians. Non-athletes were just above 5 METs, which is the prognostic prognostics of mortality and aerobic frailty. If you actually look at the graph on the top right, you can see here the line is the prognostic line with the yellow arrow. And just above it are just 2 data points from the non-athletes. And then here you can see the athletes right above, well over the 50th percentile line, and not close to the prognostic line of aerobic frailty. So each MET level above 5 METs is a lower risk by 12%. So the octogenarians in total have approximately 50% lower all-cause mortality than the untrained octogenarians. Athletes over time lose approximately 7.5% of their VO2 max per decade, and the prime VO2 max is approximately 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and a decrease in heart rate usually occurs, which would cause a decrease in aerobic capacity. However, 6 out of the 9 octogenarians had a maximum heart rate that was above 160. And this is probably due to the higher blood volume from training, which can improve heart dynamics. In conclusion, the cardiovascular and skeletal muscle profile of the octogenarian athletes was approximately double compared to the untrained octogenarian. The aerobic capacity, which was approximately 11 METs, and the functional reserve in the octogenarian athletes was the highest ever recorded. And this means essentially they had the lowest all-cause mortality risk for men of any age. And untrained octogenarians, they had low functional capacity, which is approximately, for them, was 6 METs, and limited cardiovascular and skeletal muscle plasticity with exercise intervention. And for them, they would have to have a challenge to remain about the aerobic frailty threshold. So the take-home message is that including lifelong endurance exercise improves the plasticity of physiological systems around 80 years old, and decreasing risk of mortality and disability, which could also improve overall health. So the questions. So what other male age exercise groups would you like to see octogenarian athletes VO2 max compared to, and why? Do you think that if this study was replicated with women, that similar results may follow? What part of the Fick equation is influencing high VO2 max in the octogenarian athletes? How do you think the VO2 max of the octogenarian athletes and octogenarian non-athletes compare to diagnosed frail octogenarians? Would the frail fall underneath the aerobic frailty threshold? Why do you think that the athletic octogenarians had a higher blood cholesterol than the non-athletes? How do you think the aerobic capacity and skeletal muscle profiles would compare in octogenarians who participated in resistance training as well? do you think there would be a difference in functionality between those two groups? Here are our references, and thank you for listening.